Now all that remains to complete the design is to add a bas-relief scene of some characters around the top of the goblet. This will sort of evoke the original design of the piece. If you go back and look at the original photographs, you'll notice in one of the two photos you can see that there's a scene there. And I don't want to replicate that scene exactly, but I do want the feeling that there were once some carvings on the side of people and that they faded a bit over the years. This is kind of a tricky thing to do automatically, and the steps that we're going to take aren't necessarily going to apply to every source you might want to use, but it's still a kind of a fun technique. Let's pop over to Bridge, and if we look inside our Textures and Lighting folder where we've been working this chapter, you'll find a file in here called mourners.psd. Now, this painting is from the same museum where I found the goblet that we've been using for our inspiration. And it dates back pretty far as well. This painting, if we look down here, dates to 1670. That's when it was painted. And because of that date, and because of the general history of the museum, we know that this painting commemorates the death of King Frederick III. And when Frederick III died, it was a really big deal. He was a pretty popular king. And this painting was actually commissioned by the Crown to represent the view from Frederick's grave after he'd been buried. So he's looking up from the grave, and his grave is surrounded by all of these mourners who are playing music and praying and mourning and weeping and so on. And what I want to do is take all of these characters, which are in this circular arrangement, and I want to emboss them on the outside of our cup. Now, in order to do this, we're going to need to jump through a few little hoops that I think you're going to find interesting. So let's double-click on this to launch it inside Photoshop. And the first thing we'll want to do to this image is crop it to get rid of the perspective distortion and to also get rid of all of this stuff around the edges that we don't actually need. So let's quickly draw a rough crop outline. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit and pan over so I can see more clearly what I'm doing. And making sure that the perspective button is turned on inside our crop tool. Click it if it's not already checked. We'll drag the corners up. And we're going to try to match these outer edges of the octagon, the horizontal and vertical edges of the octagon. We don't care so much about the angles. They'll take care of themselves. If you find yourself struggling on the right-hand side because of a tendency of Photoshop to snap, just add the Control key while you're dragging, and it'll allow you to ignore the snapping temporarily. Drag this over to about there. This is a slightly tedious process, but it's definitely one to learn. This is a very useful technique for a lot of images in Photoshop. You don't necessarily have to shoot stuff straight on. You can straighten it out later using perspective crop. Very handy. And once we've got this so that it looks about the way we like it, just double-click or hit Return to accept the crop. And as you can see, it does a nice job of taking the distortion away from our image. And now I'm left with an image that is circular, but is still not yet appropriate for a texture map that's going to wrap around a cylindrical object. What we need to do is to take all of these elements that are distributed around in this kind of circular fashion, and we need to straighten them out. And to do that, we're going to use a filter called polar coordinates. And if you're not familiar with it, it's an extremely handy distortion tool. We'll come up to the filter menu and choose Distort Polar Coordinates. The only thing you need to make sure about with this is that you're not set from rectangular to polar, but are in fact from polar to rectangular. And what that'll do is take a circular distribution of pixels, like what we see up here, and it's going to straighten them out into a horizontal arrangement. Click OK, and you can see the results. We basically unwrapped all of our mourners from the ringed configuration, and now they're aligned across our canvas. The aspect ratio is wrong. We need to now size this to approximately the size that we're going to need it. So come up to the Image menu, choose Image Size. Turn off Constrain Proportions if it's turned on. We don't want that. We do want to resample the image. And let's give ourselves a width of, you guessed it, 800 pixels wide and 400 pixels tall, which is the same size as the bump map that we're working with. Click OK. It's considerably smaller now, but also the distortion, as you can see, is much closer to normal, much less stretch than it was before. Now let's take a look at our individual channels to see which one of them might be the most useful to us as a map. So Command 3 lets us look at red, Command 4, green, Command 5, blue. I think our green channel represents our best bet. The blue channel would be a useful thing for keying out the sky. So at some point you might want to come back and take a look at that. But for our purposes, we want the widest dynamic range, which is definitely the green channel. So here we're going to select all and copy. And I'm going to Control-Tab over to our texture map, and I'm going to paste. And before we do anything else, I can definitely tell you in advance that the sky back here is going to be a major problem for us, because we're going to have to do quite a bit of manipulation on our foreground elements, and the sky is just going to come along for the ride. So let's attempt to solve that by going back over to our source image. We're still looking at the green channel, but with Command 2 we can go back to looking at the RGB channel. Deselect the marching ants. And come up to the Select menu and choose Color Range. And let's just click and Shift-click until we've got most of this sky. That's looking pretty good. See the selection in here, click OK. Now I'm going to just grab our elliptical marquee tool. We don't have to be real precise about this, but with the Option key held down on the Mac, Alt on Windows, I'm going to deselect some of the elements that we've selected down here at the bottom. We don't want to come along for the ride. Mostly we just want to make sure that we've selected as much of the sky as possible. Go. That's sky, that's not sky, that's not sky, that is sky. Okie doke, just cleaning up our selection. And that looks pretty good. We don't want to take this beard with us. We don't want this woman's collar. Don't want anything about this book. And this looks like a potentially big problem area for us. So I'm going to grab my lasso tool, come back over. I'm going to hold down the Option key, click, hold, lift up on the Option key or the Alt key on Windows, push it down again, and now we're subtracting with clicks, and we've deselected just that portion as well. And with the Alt key held down, I'll just get a few more of these little schnivels here and there. Get rid of them. That all looks pretty good. I'm reasonably happy with that. Let's take a look at the mask. Yep, that's not bad. And we can come up here, filter, and choose blur, Gaussian blur. Maybe nudge this up to a value of about 1.5, let's say, and click OK. Click on our mask mode again, and copy. Control-Tab back over to our texture layer, and paste. Now the layer that we've just pasted, we pasted into a grayscale file, and so while you saw a little bit of luminance change on screen, it doesn't look terribly different. But if you come down here and Option click or Alt click on Windows on this eyeball, you can see that we've basically just pasted in the sky. And if we come to the lock icons, click the first one. That'll lock the transparency of this layer. And if we come over and make sure that our foreground layer is set to black, Option delete will now fill the sky with black. So if we come back over and once again Alt click, you can see that we've done a nice job here of filling the sky with black. That means the sky will always be the lowest part of our bump map. The other things that we see in place here will be elevated above that, which is great and exactly what we want. Let's select both of these layers now and right-click to convert to Smart Object. And let's just tab over and see how we're doing in terms of our goblet. Well, at least it looks as if the relief of our various elements is heading in the right direction now. Our sky is nice and smooth, and the lowest part of our bump map, the higher stuff, is what we see down here at the bottom. It turns out we're not parked on a very interesting part of our bump map, however. So let's remedy that. Let's go back over to our map, making sure that we have our smart layer selected. Come up to the filter menu and choose Offset. And a value of anywhere from 300 to 350 will, I believe, move some of these more interesting characters into view. And just for giggles, let's move them up as well by using the vertical portion of the offset controls. Let's take it up to where the hand of our individual on the left here is just about to bump into our topmost elements. And click OK. Let's tab back over and see the results. Looking pretty good. You can see what kind of vaguely look like human shapes in here. We've lost some of our other details, but we'll get those back in a few moments. But let me apply just one or two other quick filters to exaggerate the effect that we see here, and we're going to call it done. Control tab back over, come back up here to the top and apply filter, blur, Gaussian blur. Let's crank this up to a value of about 2, let's say. And then above this layer, I'm going to apply curves. I'm going to make sure that the curves are linked to only this layer. And then let's just steepen the curve a little bit to kind of sharpen the edges of the transition between the background and the foreground layers. Once again, we're not ever really going to be able to manipulate a painting and make it look like a true bas-relief. But if our goal is to create something that looks as if it's been there for a long time and is kind of worn away, we can pull that off. So I'm pretty pleased with how this looks for now. Let's come back down to our layer 4 and add a mask layer to that. And let's try to restore some of our details that we put in by selecting the very topmost portion here and making sure that our mask is selected. I'm just going to hit Command-I to invert the mask, and that should restore some of the crinkly edges, and it looks like it does. And we'll do the same thing down here at the bottom. Come up to about here and hit Command-I, and that masks off the bottom portion as well. You can now see the letterboxing here in our mask. That's revealing the details that were hidden below that layer. So now a quick Control Tab back to our goblet, and there we go. We've got a pretty good embossed effect. If anything, it might even be too soft. I might have put a bit too much blur on it, but fortunately, the blur was applied as a smart filter to a smart object. So just double-clicking on Gaussian blur lets us adjust that. Let's take it down to a blur value of 1 instead. Control Tab back. See the results. Even better. So as you can see, we've got a nice embossed effect at the top that achieves just what we were looking for, which is to suggest the shapes of people and maybe a sort of bas-relief sculpture on the side of this that's many centuries old and perhaps has worn off a bit with time. So please feel free to explore and play with these techniques. Go back and mess around with the bump maps if you like. Try different elements in the bumps if you like. It's tremendously fun and creative to do this kind of work. The end results, as you can see, can look as photographic as you need them to be. This is just really an amazing object. To think that we've created and textured it entirely within Photoshop is just tremendous. And now in our next chapter, we're going to bring it all home. We're going to bring in our goblet. We're going to add our fire sprite that we created in Chapter 1. We're going to finish up our design, putting it all together.